Hello everyone. In a meta dominated by Power Mechanist at all levels of play, it comes perhaps as a surprise to players that the hardcore raid speedrunning community is not using it for any boss world records. In this video, I want to give a basic introduction to raid speedruns, explain where Rifle Mechanist falls short, and explain the currently most promising approach, the Bladesworn stack. There are many different rule sets for raid speedruns. In this video we will only talk about one: grinded single boss records. Timer starts when the boss fight begins and the timer ends when the boss dies. Bug abuse is forbidden and there are some restrictions on particularly annoying preparations and consumables. Crucially, speedruns are never about practical ways to kill a boss. That they often include some amount of pre-fight preparation, they arguably aren't even the fastest way to kill the boss. It's just the fighting time that is kept short. Squad composition. It is no secret that a successful raid squad requires a few components: damage, boons, and sustain. This is true on all levels of play, but for raid speedruns, these components actually take on a slightly different meaning. Damage. In normal raids, you can look at DPS classes and decide that something is viable because it can kill a boss comfortably before the enrage timer kicks in. In a speedrun, you need the highest possible damage number you can get. You can say that Condi Berserker is great right now on bosses with long phases, or that Power Soul Beast is amazing on short bursty encounters. But your competition is unfair. You are not competing against other builds on the current patch. You are competing against previous world records. This means you try to damage race most broken builds in the history of Guild Wars 2. Needless to say that in order to achieve this, you also have to break the game in some way to gain an advantage. A build being very strong is not going to be good enough. Boons. Boons go by the rule, only produce boons that are needed. How often do you hear that a particular support is supposedly amazing because it produces stability? Well, unless the boss you're trying to kill has an attack that requires stability, being able to produce stability is not an advantage. For example, on Veil Guardian, stability is not a selling point. Alacrity, quickness, 25 might, fury. These are the essential boons. Everything else is only brought if there is a particular reason to bring it. A common thread that runs through many of the speedruns in the past 2 years is to make sure that the essential boons are covered at minimal DPS loss. And what better way to do that than running DPS classes that coincidentally provide either quickness or alacrity. This was the case for Power Chronomancer and Power Catalyst in the past, and it is no different for Bladesworn records now. Multiple Bladesworn together provide quickness for the subgroup, which eliminates the need for dedicated quickness support. We'll take a closer look at Bladesworn later in the video. Sustain. Raid speedruns are grinded. A lot. While in normal raids you can use healers to recover from mistakes, for speedruns you just assume that your perfect run will not have any major mistakes, and then conclude whether you still need a healer or not. These days, most groups conclude for themselves that a full healer is not necessary. However, you still need some form of sustain. That's because classes often benefit from being at full health due to the consumable Writ of Masterful Strength and Writ of Masterful Malice, or just traits inherent to the builds. Most records play no healers at all, and some records play one healer. Now let's actually hop into the game to take a look at Bladesworn. Now I don't want to provide a class guide for Bladesworn here, I will link something in the video description. I just want to show how Bladesworn works for speedrun and what the important aspects of it are. The key thing is certainly martial cadence. The the trait that makes your soldiers focus grant quickness to allies instead of just might. Now, marching orders gives soldiers focus once every 10 seconds, and then it is consumed by using a Dragon Slash Force or any of the other Dragon Slashes, and this gives 3 seconds of quickness, and after 10 seconds the marching orders has reloaded. Now, the problem is that we can't actually use this trait off cooldown because our Bladesworn burst doesn't come every 10 seconds. It comes slightly off pace, and in practice this will mean that quickness uptime from one Bladesworn on a golem fight would just be about 20% rather than the 30% which you might assume from the 3 seconds of quickness on a 10-second interval. So with 20% quickness uptime provided by a Bladesworn, this means that even with 4 Bladesworn in a subgroup, you actually don't get permanent quickness. And we'll take a look at what that means in the boss records we're going to look at. One more thing that is maybe a bit different for the speedrunning Bladesworn is the trait Peak Performance. Now, you always take this trait, but the standard Bladesworn build doesn't actually have a physical skill. And we are going to take the trait, the skill Mending, a physical skill, which buffs the next 6 seconds of damage. And if you go Mending into Dragon Trigger, this boosts up the damage the Dragon Trigger does. Now, when taking a look at Bladesworn's damage curve, you see that its damage is mostly made up by these damage spikes in between. And obviously you have some amount of damage outside of the Dragon Trigger, but in comparison it really pales. So when thinking about Bladesworn strategies, you really need to think about how much damage do your Dragon Triggers do, and how many Dragon Triggers do you need in order to phase a boss into the next phase, or in order to complete the split phase. Now, this has a very peculiar effect. If you conclude that you need, let's say, 18 Dragon Triggers to complete something, it doesn't actually matter whether you have 6 Bladesworn or 7 Bladesworn or 8 Bladesworn in your comp. You're going to need these 18 Dragon Triggers. That means each of them will need to provide 3 Dragon Triggers. If you have 8, some of them only need to provide 2, but you're still time gated by the Bladesworn who need to come up with 3 Dragon Triggers in that phase. So this means that Bladesworns actually have a very set and fixed time that they need to complete a boss phase, and you can actually calculate how fast you can get with Bladesworn. This is in contrast to other classes which can just get better and better phases once you play them better. For Bladesworn you're really restricted in that regard. So we now take a look at the Gorseval record by MCA, My Chaotic Asylum, and we're going to see some of the most important concepts of it. Now, the start of it is that in this first phase where they bring Gorseval to 66%, you're going to see that they need exactly 3 Dragon Triggers for it. Now, this means that this first phase has a very set duration that is set in stone, and there's nothing they can do to really speed it up. However, what's important is when you look at the buff bar, only now does the Bladesworn get quickness for the first time, and quickness boon in general during this fight will actually not be have that great of an uptime. You will see quickness drop again very soon. Now they are without quickness for a while. Now this is one of the ways to handle that Bladesworn doesn't provide 100% quickness even when stacked, is to just ignore it. And the idea behind ignoring it is that you're dropping quickness whenever you're charging up a Dragon Trigger, so it doesn't really affect your rotation. And now he has quickness again once the Dragon Trigger comes through. and the boss has been faced with exactly three dragon triggers. And what they are using in terms of sustain on this boss are 2 alacrity specters, which also provide the alacrity to make sure that the cooldowns come up faster again. Otherwise, 3 dragon triggers would take longer to recharge. So, and these specters also provide massive barrier whenever they exit Shroud, and so this is enough to sustain the Bladesworns above 90% health for their Writ uptime from Writ of Masterful Strength. Let's take a look at the key innovation of this skill, which is the split phase, because for now the damage phase wasn't particularly fast, right? There are other comps that could have a similar phase time for phase 1, or maybe for the later phases at least. But now comes the really smart part of this record, and as you can see in the background here, there's a shadow portal exit, and their thief is going to open a shadow portal entrance here next to the soul, and now they charge up the dragon trigger, and they're pressing the 2 skill which dashes forward, and during the dash they are taking the shadow portal in order to not only cleave down this ad here, which is already dead, but also to cleave down the other ad on the other side. And this is really what brings them this big advantage over other records. And as I have said, in order to compete with Power Chronomancer, Catalyst, and Dragon Hunter for this specific boss, in order to compete with these all-time records with very broken strategies, what you want to do also needs to be very broken. And by doing the split phase like this, they essentially reduce the time by 5 seconds or more for each split phase, and that's really good. In other records, classes would have to split up in four directions on each spirit, and the spirits take a lot longer to kill than this. Now in the next phase, we are going to see 4 dragon triggers being employed, although the 4th one is just a partial dragon trigger. As you can see in the buff bar, we have more boons that are technically required. And these boons come from the Spectre, and they buff Bladesworn's damage through the trait Empowered, which says that Bladesworn does 1% more damage for each boon it has currently running. So Bladesworn is kind of an exception to the earlier rule I've said that you only want to produce the boons that are strictly needed. For Bladesworn, every boon you get is an additional 1% damage. Now we see the 4th dragon trigger. And now comes something that is special again with Bladesworn. And MCA has found out that if you damage Gorseval right now while he's literally lying on the floor, he actually can't phase. And so they burst him now, and this brings him to 31% health instead of phasing him at 33%. So having this extra damage in this phase is actually quite beneficial for them in the next phase. This is just a small detail they did, but it also speeds up the final phase a lot. And again, the split phase strategy is going to be to charge through and get back to the boss. And observe the use of Mending before using the Dragon Slash. Now they want to kill with this next Dragon Slash, so they need to maximize the damage it can really do here. And that's the kill. Where Rifle Mechanist falls short. Since raid bosses are grinded so much, the rotation is actually fully scripted. This removes the main advantage of Rifle Mechanist, namely being able to do damage when things go wrong for other builds. In speedruns, nothing goes wrong. Even ignoring for a moment that Rifle Mechanist lacks the boon output of Bladesworn, this will result in Rifle Mechanist just being plain worse at DPS than a Bladesworn due to having a lower golem benchmark / damage output. Furthermore, the damage output of Rifle Mechanist is not broken. The reason Bladesworn is getting records is that its high burst allows to speed up split phases in ways Chronomancer and Catalyst never had access to before. So far, nobody has found a unique advantage for Rifle Mechanist that would break the game in a similar way. Thank you so much for watching this video. A shout out goes out to the German speedrunning guild MCA, My Chaotic Asylum, for letting me use their Gorseval and Veil Guardian clips to showcase the Bladesworn stack strategy. After End of Dragon's release, MCA has gone on a spree of taking over many boss records, first with Catalyst and now with Bladesworn. What sets them apart from other guilds is their extremely high individual DPS output due to a high amount of practice, combined with an ability to think outside the box for their team compositions. Keep an eye out for further boss records from them.